mam przyjemność i zaszczyt powitać Państwa na wykładzie profesora Coyne'a z Chicago. Ja teraz przełączę się na język angielski. So this is my great pleasure and honor for me to introduce Professor Coyne here, who is an evolutionary biologist, and he works on the University of Chicago. He's one of the most prominent biologists working on speciation, or on the origin of species, in fact, because the speciation is the process when a new species origins. Well, he's also very well-known popularizer of science, and especially evolutionary biology. His recent book, Why Evolution is True, was recently released in Polish as Ewolucja jest faktem. It is one of the best account on a popular book on evolutionary biology, and introduced this this topic very clearly, which is accessible for both lay people, but also very useful for students and also scientists. Professor Coyne works mostly on population ecology and genetics of Drosophila, which made great progress in understanding of how the species can origin. But at the beginning of his career, which is much closer to my interest because I am a herpetologist, so I'm interested in reptiles, amphibians, and so on, he also found a small frog, which happens to be a new species, and it's named after Professor Coyne, so it's Atelopus coyneyi. So it's also great honor to be patron for new species. So I think it's time to listen to the answer why evolution is true, and I give the microphone for Professor.
Thank you. After my work is long gone, the frog will still be with us, so that gives me some consolation. Two apologies to begin with, and a thank you. First, thanks to the university and to the rationalists who have invited me here at Coyne. It's been a great stay. The two apologies are that, first of all, I have a limited time, so I'm going to have to speak very rapidly, and I don't speak Polish. So most of the slides you'll be able to understand by looking at the Polish screen on the left, on the right for you guys, and I guess that's the only apology in my lack of Polish. I can say dzień dobry, and piwo, that's better. So what I want to do is very quickly explain the evidence for evolution, and then explain why it's important that everybody understand that. And many people in this audience probably knows this evidence already. If you don't, my book is available as Christopher Hitchens would say, at fine bookstores everywhere. So here's the problem. This is a view of 32 European countries, plus Turkey and the United States, with the acceptance of evolution in each of these countries. The blue bar shows the proportion of population that accepts evolution. The red bar are those who deny evolution as a scientific fact, and the yellow ones are the don't knows. So it's listed from countries on the left, from Iceland all the way down to Turkey. If you ask, can you hear me, by the way? If you ask where the United States goes, we're right there. Well, next to the bottom. So it's about 40% of Americans accept evolution, and about another 30 or 40% accept creation. A lot of these are theistic evolutionists who think that God guided evolution, so that doesn't really count. If you're asking where Coyne is, you're better off than the United States. It's about 60% acceptance, but still about 30% rejection, and about 10% well, you don't know. So this is a problem, because the theory of evolution, as I'll try to explain, is a true theory. It's as true as the existence of atoms, as the existence of bacteria or viruses, and yet we have this tremendous rejection of this theory. Not only in my country, but in your country. Only in countries like Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden, which are largely atheistic countries, is there widespread acceptance of evolution. So to remedy this problem, and in the United States, we're constantly facing court battles about evolution, where creationists try to have their materials taught in court. To try to do something like this problem, I wrote the book that was just mentioned, Why Evolution is True. There's the Polish version there, in hopes that by educating people about the evidence for evolution, they would change their minds about it. That turned out to be sort of a futile hope for reasons I'll explain at the end. But I still want to go through the evidence today, because I think evolution is one of the greatest achievements of the human intellect, this bit of our body figuring out where it came from, The evidence is multifarious. It comes from many disciplines. It's also quite cool. And I'll try to give some examples that are exciting. And it shows how science works in progress. That is, we have evolution on one side, the contrary theory, creationism over here, and we can see how the facts can help us decide between these two theories. So what I want to do first is tell you what we mean by true in science, and then talk about what a theory really is, very briefly. Tell you what the theory of evolution is, and then at the end, most of the lecture, the evidence for evolution. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about why people are so resistant to evolution. So what do we mean by a scientific claim being true? We don't mean absolute truth in the sort of religious or philosophical sense. We mean it in the sense that Steve Gould meant it when he said, it's an assertion for which there is so much evidence that you would have to be perverse or blinkered to reject it. And I want to convince you in this lecture that that evolution is true in this limited sense. It's true in the same sense that the existence of atoms are true, the existence of disease-causing bacteria are true, and of course, evolution itself is true. The evidence comes from just many, many fields. It all points to one thing, evolution. It points away from the alternative creationist theory. Okay? Now everybody says that, well, evolution is only a theory, and you can dismiss it on those grounds, but that comes from a misconception of what we mean by a scientific theory, which is not just a wild guess or a speculation. It is, and it comes from the accumulation of facts. When you have enough facts, then you accumulate a theoretical schema, a coherent group of propositions that's meant to explain those facts. And that coherent group of propositions is called a scientific theory. It's not just a wild guess, it is an explanatory schema for what you see about nature. And so the theories that we have are the atomic theory, that's called a theory, that matter is made up of atoms, that there's the germ theory of disease, that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms, and the theory of evolution. And all of these are called theories. That does not mean that they're wrong or they're speculative in a very nebulous sense, but simply that they're coherent. When a theory develops so much evidence that supports it, as these theories have, then it becomes a fact, or what I call a true theory. And so in that sense, evolution is not only a theory, but also a fact at the same time. It's a fact in the same way the atomic theory is a fact and the germ theory of disease is a fact. So there I've explained what we mean by truth and how we show that the theory becomes true. Then I'll tell you what the theory of evolution is, because it's actually 5 parts, and then I'll talk about the data that has converted evolution from a pure theory into a true theory. So what is the theory of evolution? And it's actually 5 separate assertions about the world, each of which has to be tested independently of the others. And I hope if you can't follow the English that you'll be able to follow the Polish, because what I say here will be largely manifested in the slides. First of all, evolution happens, and what we mean by evolution is genetic change in a population over time. That's part 1. Part 2 is that change happens gradually. It's not that something is a dog one day and it evolves to a cat the next day. This change takes thousands to millions of years to happen. Okay, and this is independent of part 1, because you could have evolution, but it could be very quick. So each of these has to be tested separately. The third part is, and that's another separate assertion, that there's speciation, that a lineage that undergoes genetic change will split into other lineages. So here we have one splitting into 2 different species, B and C, and this has happened since the beginning of life, about 3.6 billion years ago. This is the family tree of all life. In fact, this is just a small section of it because we know it so well now, and you can see it's so branchy that we have to put it in the form of a circle rather than just a tree. This is not US, this is us, human beings. And you can see we're just one small twig on the branch of this family tree. So this should give us some humility about things. Part 4 of the theory of evolution is simply the converse of part 3. That is, if things split, then if you trace them backwards, then you will find a common ancestor at some point in time. And all species, no matter what they are, share a common ancestor. So this is basically the same as part 3, but looked at from forward to backwards instead of backwards to forwards. And in terms of humans, this is our ancestry with the other primates. You can see this is a family tree of humans. We branched off from the chimpanzees about the modern ancestor, the ancient ancestor of chimps about 6 million years ago, gorillas about 10 million years ago, orangs about 13 million years ago, all the way back to lemurs and insectivores. And what we mean with as closely related is that we mean that we branched off from something, their common ancestor, more recently. That's the definition of more related in science. And finally, much of the change that's occurred this way has been through the process of natural selection. It's the only process we know of that can produce in animals and plants the appearance of them having been designed, which of course used to be taken as evidence for the existence of the divine creator. Now we know that we have this materialistic process that can explain the same thing. So those are the 5 parts of evolution. You can see that they're sort of independent. You can have evolution, but it doesn't have to be fast or slow. We can have evolution without splitting, in which case we'd only have one species. And you can have evolution that's not caused by natural selection. And there are some kinds of evolution that aren't caused by natural selection, although the appearance of design is. So each of these tenets of the theory of evolution has to be given separate evidence. You have to support all 5 of them if you want to say evolution is true. So what I'll do for the rest of the lecture is to try to give you evidence for each of these 5 propositions. And many of you all know this already. If you don't, you can read the book or you can go to sleep or whatever. But I'll try to give some examples that will keep people awake. Let me begin with the predictions of the theory of evolution, because as a good scientific theory, evolution predicts what we will see. It makes predictions about what we'll see when we look into nature. And if the theory can't do that or can't be tested, it is not a scientific theory. The first and most obvious prediction of evolution, which is one that Darwin made in 1859, is that if we look into the distant past and we look at the beginning of life, we can see that organisms are very simple. Because evolution cannot start with something very complex. It has to start with something simple, which Darwin posited, and then gradually we should see more complex forms evolving. But the simple ones should also remain there, because there's also an advantage to being simple. And in fact, this is exactly what you see in the fossil record. This is the geologic time scale, starting with the formation of the Earth at 4.6 billion years ago, up to the present. These names have changed a bit over time. But on the right, you see the appearance of different kinds of plants and animals. And you see that it actually follows the predictions of evolution. The first life we see at about 3.6 billion years ago is very simple. In fact, there it is. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is a blue-green algae. It's actually a bacteria, a cyanobacteria, these are called stromatolites, and these are just layers of this bacteria that have been found in Australia and also other places. And then we see over time that more complex forms of life appear gradually. Bacteria, of course, are still with us. It's not that there's a one-way move, but everything becomes more complex. It's just that the theory predicts that you have to start simple, and complexity comes only after a period of time. And that's exactly what this slide shows. Another prediction of the theory is that you should be able to see in the fossil record a lineage changing over time. And you should also be able to see the splitting events, the sort of speciation events where one lineage turns into 2 that is predicted by Darwin. And again, in 1859, when Darwin made this theory, we had no good examples of either of these. There was no good fossil record 150 years ago. So these predictions have been tested only since the time of Darwin. And there's a million examples of gradual change in speciation. This is only one that I can give you. This is the evolution of the horse over the past 50 million years. Horses started as very small, deer-like animals that had either 5 or 6 toes. They were about this big. And then over time, and you can see this in the fossils in North America, they get larger and larger and larger. They lose their toes one by one, starting with the 2 outer toes, then the 2 middle toes, and we're left with the modern horses, all of them having only a single toe. So what you see from this record of horse evolution, and we have a very good fossil record of horses with good dates associated with each of these forms, 2 things. First of all, we see genetic change over time. We can trace a single lineage from this species to this species, showing that it takes 50 million years. So we see change and gradualism. But we can also see the speciation or splitting events, because there's lots of different horses that formed over time but went extinct. Okay? And again, this was predicted by Darwin. but was not really verified until more recently. Other predictions are basically that if there is this splitting, we should be able to find common ancestors of species, often known as missing links, although that's not a very correct way to describe it. One of the most earliest predictions of evolution was made by Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's friend and defender, who predicted, based on the similarities in the physiology and behavior of reptiles, modern reptiles and modern birds, that modern birds descended from ancient reptiles. And some of the similarities are the way their hearts are formed. Reptiles and birds both lay eggs. So Huxley posited that at some time in the past, birds had evolved from reptiles. But there was no example of that at the time. Actually there was, but nobody recognized it as Archaeopteryx. So what we want to look for is this sort of common ancestor between birds and reptiles. This is the so-called missing link. But actually this is a misnomer, because to find this missing link, this is a single species of ancient reptile that gave rise on one of its descendant lineages to all modern reptiles, and the other lineage gave rise to modern birds. And to find a single species in the fossil record, we wouldn't even know this was the common ancestor, is an impossible task, because over 99.9% of all species that ever existed, we don't know as fossils. They're down in the ground, they've been ground up, etc. So how can we test the idea that birds came from reptiles if we cannot find this single species? And the answer is, we look for transitional forms. That is, we don't have to find this one ancestor. If we can just trace bird lineages back and show that as they go back further in time, they become more like reptiles, then that is sufficient evidence that birds evolved from reptiles. And in fact, this was again a prediction made in about 1860. It was not really verified in great detail until the past 30 years, with the discovery in China of many birds or dinosaurs, or you can't even decide what they are because they're a mixture of birds and dinosaurs. Let me just show you how creationists try to attack this theory. They say, well, if birds came from reptiles, then this is what we should find in the fossil record. This is called a crocodile. When they show the slide, everybody laughs and says, well, evolutionary biologists are really stupid. How could something like that possibly be a viable organism? And it couldn't. I mean, crocodiles are if you know what croc means in English, you know that they're crocs of something or other. But this isn't exactly what we see in the fossil record. What we do see is a much better common ancestor. This is an example of a transitional form between a reptile and a bird. This is called Sinornithosaurus millennia, and it lived about 150 million years ago. And its skeleton, this is the fossil, which was found only about 10 years ago, is very similar to that of a theropod dinosaur. And in fact, birds are dinosaurs. They descended from theropod dinosaurs. You can see the similarity between this thing and this thing. It has reptile-like features, has teeth. You can't see them very well. It has unfused hand bones, so the fingers are separate, which modern birds aren't. If you look at your chicken, the drumstick looks, the wing looks like this, and it has this long bony tail, which modern birds don't have. So here we see something that looks very much like a dinosaur. And in fact, what was mistaken for dinosaurs, except that in this particular thing, you see the existence of feathers. Here's the feather impressions here, feather impressions there. What we have here is a feathered dinosaur. And in fact, in the last 20 or 30 years, we found many of these things, which are transitional forms. They have a combination of characteristics of early dinosaurs, theropods, and birds. And as we go more and more closer to modern times, these things lose their tails, their fingers become fused, the feathers become larger. This is what better example of a transitional form, of a prediction that was met could you have than this one. That's what it looked like, probably. It's a reconstruction of what it looked like. They probably could not fly. We're pretty sure it couldn't fly because the feathers were too small. Feathers probably evolved for reasons other than flight, perhaps for thermoregulation or for sexual attraction. Not only is this show the characteristics you expect of a transitional form, it occurs at the right time in the fossil record, 150 million years ago, after we already have these guys, but before we have modern birds. So there's actually two kinds of evidence here, the morphological evidence and the evidence that it shows up in the fossil record right exactly where it should. Here's another bit of evidence that has been discovered in the last 20 or 30 years. That's the evolution of, I don't know if you can see this very well, but the evolution of whales from land animals. Whales are mammals, of course, which were known from genetic evidence to have re-entered the sea about 40 billion years ago and evolved into whales. Of course, creationists said that's stupid, that God put them in the sea. But then we began finding fossils like this one, which is Basilosaurus, which lived about 40 million years ago. And this is 50 feet long, which I guess is about 16 meters or so. I tend to use English measurements, which is not a good thing to do in science. But you can see that we have here a dinosaur that is it's about 16 meters long. And if you look carefully at it, you have these little bits here that are about 45 centimeters long, or about this big, okay, attached to the skeleton. But this thing was completely marine. So what are these little things? That's what happens when you enlarge them. They're tiny little legs, only about this big, and they have every characteristic of an ancestral leg, as if it evolved from a land animal. Here's the femur, the tibia and the fibula, the tarsals and metatarsals, and the toes. Completely useless. They're there simply as a testimony that this animal evolved from something that had legs in the first place. Now, how do you explain this on a creationist? The alternative way to look at this is, well, creationists say this thing was created, but then why would a divine creator give useless legs to a marine mammal? The only explanation has to be it evolved from a land animal, and it evolved from an animal that was very much like this, Indo-Hyas, which is a deer-like animal, again about this big, and they live in Southeast Asia. They're relatives, and they're semi-aquatic mammals. And we have a perfect fossil record from about 50 to 40 million years ago of these things becoming more and more whale-like, losing their ears, their nostrils moving on top of their heads for blowholes, their rear limbs shrinking to nothing, and a lot of other changes occurring. And of course, one of the greatest examples of predicted transitional forms, predicted by Darwin in 1870, was the existence of the human fossil record. Here's a modern chimpanzee and a modern human. These are all ancient hominin skulls in temporal order. And you can see that with time, these are arrayed in order of when they're finding that the brain gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the teeth get smaller. Something that looks very much like a chimpanzee becomes over time something like a modern human. These again were predicted, but not found until beginning of the 20th century by Raymond Dart and others. Evolution also makes retrodictions, that is, things that we can't predict, but we can only understand in retrospect from the theory of evolution. Here's one of them. This is from embryology, and again, Darwin talks a little about this in his book. This is a 24-day-old embryo of a spotted dolphin. There's a dolphin there. You know dolphins have front limbs, but they don't have hind limbs. Yet they once had hind limbs, as evolution postulates, because they were terrestrial animals. And yet when you look at the development of this animal, you see that it develops not only these forelimb buds, which are destined to become the flippers of the dolphin, right there, but it also starts to form rear legs. And this is exactly what we see in humans. Here's a human embryo at 30 days. Notice the similarities, very fish-like, it has branchial arches, these turn into gills, these into the jaw. And you see the forelimb buds here, and the hind limb buds here, exactly like a dolphin. And in humans, this goes on to form the arms, and this goes on to form the legs. But in dolphins, we have these legs that start to form, and then if you look a few days later, well actually, 14 days later, they're gone. So what we see is this puzzle in embryology that an animal that does not have rear legs starts to form them, and then they go away. And how does a creationist and in other organisms to which this is related, these things do develop into legs. The dolphins don't have legs. How do we explain this? The only possible explanation is that dolphins carry the genetic information for making legs, but they don't express it. At some point in evolution, when they became marine, they lost the ability to make legs, probably because the genes became inactivated. Occasionally you find a mutation in a dolphin, and here's one of them. This is a mutant dolphin, where those legs continue to develop. So here we have this very rare dolphin that has rear legs, and if you dissected these, you're going to see the bones of the real leg. But this is a rarity. And again, creationism cannot explain anything like this at all. If you posit that animals had no evolutionary history, but were created in a specific way by a creator, then things like this become complete mysteries. And all you can say is, it's God's will. But that's not a very good answer, because that's just post facto explanation. Whereas this is actually something that could be understood as a result of evolutionary biology. We show the same thing. This is a human embryo at the age of about 6 months. All of us, you and me, everybody here, are covered with a thick coat of hair at about the age of 6 months in the womb. It's called the lanugo. And this is a premature infant, so it's been born at about 6 months, and you can see it's still very hairy. We all have that. How do you explain that why we have all this hair, and then it disappears before we're born? We're born as naked eggs, but in utero we're hairy eggs. We don't need hair at 6 months old because we're floating around in a warm bath of liquid, and hair is completely useless. How do we explain this? The answer is simple. We were descended from animals that were hairy, and chimpanzee embryos have the same kind of hair, and they're born with it. In humans, we start off showing our ancestral condition, and then we lose it. The hair falls off at some point in development. Other retrodictions are vestigial organs. That is, there are many animals and plants that show traces of their ancestry that can only be understood as a result of evolutionary biology. This is the skeleton of a gray whale. You can't see it very well, but if you see one in a museum, you can see these little nubbins which are hanging by wires from the skeleton. And in fact, these are the remnants of the pelvis and the legs of whales. And again, they make no sense. They serve no function because they're not even connected to the rest of the whale. Evolution can explain this because this used to have legs in its ancestral form. The legs are still there, but they've gone away. Occasionally, again, we still see some mutant whales. This is from a humpback whale, discovered in 1922, where the legs are actually about a little less than 1 meter long. We see the femur, the tibia, and the tarsal bones, about that big. So some whales do get legs, and again, how do you explain this except by evolution? Another prediction of evolution is if we see vestigial organs, we see remnants of our ancestors, because we have genes still in our bodies that come from our ancestors. They've just been silenced or turned off. Then maybe we should, if we could sequence the genome, find remnants of those kinds of genes. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. And this isn't a very new finding. Here's a human embryo at 4 weeks. It has this balloon connected to it, but it doesn't have anything in it. This is an empty balloon connected to an embryonic human. Does anybody know what this thing is? What? It's a vestigial organ. Can anybody guess what that is? Think about a chicken. This is a yolk sac, okay? We have yolk sacs when we're embryos, but there's no yolk in it because we don't need to be nourished by yolk. We get our nourishment from the placenta. And yet we still produce this as a vestigial organ. From this, biologists predicted that maybe we still have the genes for making the proteins in yolks, but they're no longer expressed in the humans because we don't need them anymore. And this became possible to find when we sequenced the human genome. And lo and behold, we find that we have 3 genes in our DNA for making yolk proteins, but they're all silenced. They have mutations in them that have turned them off so they're not expressed. Now, how would a creationist explain in a human genome this vestigial organ, which used to contain yolk in our ancestors, which are reptiles, and we have the genes for making yolk proteins that are dead, they're not expressed. And there's lots, our genome is a veritable graveyard of useless genes. Most of the DNA in our bodies doesn't do anything, but it does testify to our ancestry. We have genes, a whole pathway for making vitamin C, but it doesn't do anything because we cannot make vitamin C. That's why sailors get scurvy. They have to take it from the outside. Our ancestors had vitamin C from fruit.